But when the planes landed, something invisible stepped off with the soldiers, something that refused to leave. And no one in America was prepared for what came home with them. The cameras of the early 1970s loved parades, flags waving, brass bands echoing through downtown streets, smiling politicians shaking hands with young men in uniform. From the outside, it looked like closure, like victory, or at least relief. The war was ending. The boys were coming home. America could finally exhale. But beneath the noise of celebration, there was a silence that didn't belong. A silence carried in the eyes of the returning soldiers, in the way they flinched at sudden sounds, in how their hands never fully relaxed. What exactly had followed them across the ocean? At airports across California, Texas, and New York, families waited behind metal barriers. Mothers clutched handmade signs. Fathers stood stiff, unsure whether to smile or salute. Wives scanned every face, terrified they might not recognize the man they married. When reunions happened, they were fast, awkward, incomplete. Arms wrapped around bodies that felt familiar, but distant. How do you welcome someone home when part of them never left the jungle? The smell of jet fuel mixed with cigarette smoke. Loudspeakers crackled. Somewhere a baby cried. A soldier dropped his duffel bag when a cart backfired nearby, his body hitting the floor before his mind could catch up. People stared. Someone laughed nervously. Was this just exhaustion or something far worse? America believed the war was over. The soldiers knew better, because wars don't end when governments say they do they? By 1973, the United States was deeply divided. Protest signs still leaned against brick walls. Burned draft cards littered old memories. College campuses bore scars of clashes between students and police. For years, soldiers had been sent overseas under the banner of duty, only to return to a country that wasn't sure it wanted them back. Unlike previous wars, there were no clear heroes waiting at home. No unified narrative. Vietnam had fractured the American conscience. Some saw returning soldiers as victims. Others saw them as symbols of a war they wanted to forget. And many simply looked away. In small towns across the Midwest, men came home to factories that no longer needed them. Assembly lines slowed. Layoff notices arrived without warning. A man who had survived ambushes and landmines now stood in unemployment lines, staring at the floor, wondering how survival had brought him here. What happens when a nation trains you to fight, but not to live? At night, bedrooms became battlegrounds. Veterans woke drenched in sweat, choking on air that smelled like damp soil and gunpowder. In their minds, helicopters never stopped circling. The distant hum of traffic turned into the whir of rotors. Fireworks became mortar fire. Doors slammed and men dove for cover while their families froze in fear. How do you explain to your children that you're not afraid of them, but of memories? Hospitals weren't ready. The term PTSD barely existed in public conversation. Doctors called it combat fatigue or shell shock, outdated labels that minimize something far deeper. Many veterans were told to toughen up, to be grateful they were alive, to move on. But move on to where exactly? The smell of damp earth lingered in their dreams. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed in quiet living rooms. Even the weight of silence pressed harder than body armor ever had. Communities began to notice changes. Bars filled with men who drank not for pleasure, but for quiet. Police reports showed rising domestic disputes involving veterans. Prisons slowly filled with men who had once worn the uniform of their country. Pastors, teachers, and neighbors whispered the same question in different ways. What happened to them over there? Yet the most dangerous battles were the ones fought alone. Suicides increased quietly without headlines. A single car accident on a rural road, a hunting rifle cleaned one last time, a garage filled with exhaust. Families grieved in private, unsure whether to blame the war, the government, or themselves. Was this collateral damage America refused to count? For every veteran who broke down publicly, dozens disappeared into ordinary life. Marriages, jobs, routines, while carrying something corrosive inside. They learned to hide it, to smile, to say they were fine. But what does fine mean after you've learned how fragile life really is? They survived the jungle. They survived the enemy. So why was home proving more dangerous than the war itself? By the mid-1970s, America was changing fast. Trust in government was collapsing after Watergate. Factories were shutting down. Cities were struggling with crime and drugs. And into this unstable landscape stepped hundreds of thousands of veterans, men trained for combat, released into a society that offered confusion instead of purpose. Some tried to organize. Veteran groups formed in church basements and community halls, sharing stories they couldn't tell anyone else. Others joined protests, not against the country, but against being forgotten by it. They demanded recognition, treatment, dignity. Many were ignored, and still the war lingered. In the way fathers sat with their backs to restaurant walls, in the way crowds triggered panic instead of comfort, in the way silence could feel louder than gunfire. America wanted to turn the page. Veterans were stuck rereading the same chapter every night. The war had ended on paper, but in the minds of those who fought it, it was only beginning. And soon, one question would start to haunt an entire nation. What happens when a country asks its soldiers to forget a war they are still fighting inside? No one screamed. No one asked for help. But across the country, invisible cracks were spreading through the walls of American homes. During the day, America kept working. Factory whistles blew. Office lights flickered on. Schools opened their doors. Veterans were expected to fall back into this rhythm, as if the war were nothing more than a date crossed off a calendar. Uniforms were packed away. Medals slipped into drawers. Normal life was supposed to return. But normal for whom? For many veterans, silence was the loudest sound of all. Hours passed without conversation, only to return heavier at night. Television stayed on in living rooms, but no one was really watching. The calm voice of news anchors couldn't drown out the storm inside. An unseen tension moved through these homes, something brittle, something ready to snap at any moment. When would that silence finally break? Marriages were the first to crack. Spouses realized they were living with a stranger inside a familiar body. Touch became cautious. Questions remained unfinished. What was it like over there? Often hung in the air, unanswered, too heavy to carry. And some nights, those unanswered questions slammed doors shut. How long can a relationship survive on memories that can't be spoken? They survived the battlefield, but inside their own homes they were slowly disappearing. Who was going to notice? Children sensed the change first. Their father's sudden anger, the distance in their eyes, the sharp edge in their voices. Small things triggered big reactions. A dropped plate, loud laughter, a door closing too fast. A home that should have felt safe turned into a place of uncertainty. Who could a child tell about that fear? Teachers noticed it too. Some children withdrew. Others became aggressive. School counselors were overwhelmed. No one had training for the war coming. Home? Society didn't even have a name for what it was seeing. How do you fight something you can't define? Meanwhile, the streets spoke a different language. Bars were full. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. Old songs played on jukeboxes. Familiar melodies that offered no comfort. For many veterans, alcohol became the fastest way to silence the images in their heads. One more drink, one more moment of quiet. How long could that escape last? The cold glass stuck to the palm of a hand. The burn of cheap whiskey scraped down the throat. The low hum of the room raced against a pounding heart. Police records began to fill up. Minor fights, noise complaints, domestic disturbances. Veterans were often labeled troublemakers, with no questions asked. Wearing the uniform no longer opened doors. It raised suspicion instead. Had the country grown afraid of the very people it sent to fight for it? Hospital waiting rooms filled, but answers were scarce. Some doctors cared. Others were exhausted or detached. Prescriptions were written, Brief appointments ended with the same reassurance. It'll pass with time. But for many, time only sharpened the pain. Could healing happen without understanding? And pain that isn't understood always finds another outlet. The pills numbed it. The alcohol dulled it. But nothing erased the memories, did it? Some veterans walked away from their homes. No goodbyes. They hitchhiked from town to town, slept in cheap motels, took day jobs on construction sites. It was easy to disappear. No one asked questions. America was vast, and for those who wanted to vanish, it offered plenty of space. But can a man really run from himself? Others stayed physically, not mentally. They went to work, sat at dinner tables, smiled when expected, but something inside had broken loose. They lived like quiet strangers in their own lives. Doesn't loneliness weigh heavier when you're surrounded by people? Communities split in two. Some tried to help. Churches collected donations. Volunteers organized meetings. Others turned away. There was no system. The government moved slowly. Society hesitated, and in that gap, a question began to grow louder. Who was responsible for these men now? The silence had cracked, but what emerged from it would catch America unprepared. Because soon, these invisible wounds would spill into the streets, the courtrooms and the headlines, and the nation would be forced to look. The first headline didn't mention the war, the second didn't either. But by the third, it was impossible to ignore where the violence was really coming from. By the mid-1970s, America began to notice patterns it could no longer explain away. Police blotters filled with familiar details. Former soldiers, late-night arrests, bar fights that escalated too fast, domestic disputes that ended in sirens. Judges saw the same faces return to their courtrooms. Reporters started asking quiet questions. Was this just crime, or something unfinished spilling into public view? In city after city, veterans stood before judges who had never heard gunfire outside a training range. Sentences were handed down without context. Files were stamped. Lives were redirected. The war had taught these men how to react instantly, decisively, violently if necessary. Civilian life demanded patience, restraint, and trust. What happens when instinct and expectation collide? On the streets, tension was visible. A hand in a jacket pocket made officers nervous. A raised voice brought batons out faster than words. Veterans learned quickly that the uniform they once wore now worked against them. Respect had expired. Suspicion had replaced it. When did service turn into liability? They were trained to fight enemies. Now they were treated like one. How did it come to this? Courthouses weren't the only places feeling the strain. Emergency rooms began to fill with familiar stories told in fragments. Cuts from broken glass, bruises explained away as accidents, overdoses that weren't quite suicide, but weren't mistakes either. Doctors stitched bodies while the real injuries remained untouched. How many times can you treat the symptom and ignore the cause? Outside hospitals, families waited. Some hoped for answers, others feared them. Mothers who had prayed for their sons' safe return now prayed for something else entirely, that they would survive peace. How cruel was it that safety had become the greater danger? Media coverage shifted slowly, cautiously. Television segments spoke of a veteran's adjustment problem. Newspapers mentioned psychological strain, but the language stayed distant, clinical, careful not to accuse the war itself. America wasn't ready to question the cost of its decisions, was it? Fluorescent hospital lights hummed overhead. The smell of antiseptic burned the nose. Somewhere down the hall, a man shouted in his sleep. As pressure mounted, veterans began organizing again. This time louder. Marches formed, signs were raised. Testimonies were shared in town halls and on courthouse steps. Men who had once followed orders now demanded answers, treatment, recognition, accountability. Their voices shook, but they did not stop. What happens when the forgotten refuse to stay silent? Still, backlash followed. Commentators questioned their stability. Neighbors whispered about safety. Employers hesitated. Compassion clashed with fear, and fear often won. The same society that asked, These men to sacrifice now debated whether they were worth helping. How does a nation measure responsibility after the damage is done? Behind closed doors, government agencies scrambled. Committees formed. Reports were drafted. Budgets were debated. Progress was slow, tangled in bureaucracy and politics. For veterans waiting in pain, delay felt like betrayal. How long can patience last when survival is already uncertain? They were finally being seen. But being seen didn't mean being saved. What would it take for real change? The most devastating moments, however, never reached the news. They happened in kitchens, garages, quiet bedrooms. A final argument. A note left unfinished. A sound no family ever forgets. Each loss rippled outward. Children growing up with absence. Spouses carrying guilt. Communities pretending not to notice. How many lives could disappear before the country truly responded? By the late 1970s, one truth was becoming impossible to deny. Vietnam had not ended. It had simply changed shape. It lived in court records, hospital charts, obituary columns, and living rooms across the nation. And America stood at a crossroads. Acknowledge it, or keep paying the price in silence. The wounds were visible now. The cost was undeniable, but the most dangerous question was still unanswered. What happens when a nation realizes too late that healing requires more than forgetting? The help finally came, but it came in the wrong shape, at the wrong speed, and for too few people. And by the time America realized it, the damage was already spreading. As public pressure grew, the government was forced to respond. Hearings were announced. Task forces assembled. Reports acknowledged what veterans had been saying for years. Something was wrong. But recognition did not equal readiness. The institutions meant to care for returning. Soldiers had been designed for an earlier kind of war, shorter, clearer, and easier to leave behind. Vietnam fit none of those definitions. Could an outdated system handle a new kind of trauma? Veterans Affairs hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately. Long hallways filled with men waiting silently on plastic chairs. Appointment lists stretched for months. Some gave up before their names were called. Others never made it through the doors at all. How long can someone ask for help before silence feels like the only answer? Inside these facilities, resources were scarce. Doctors worked long shifts with limited training in combat-related psychological trauma. Group therapy sessions placed strangers in circles, asking them to speak about things they had spent years burying. Some found relief. Many shut down. Pain doesn't move on a schedule. Why was treatment expected to? The country admitted there was a problem, but admission wasn't the same as care. Who was being left behind? Outside the hospitals, another reality unfolded. Veterans who couldn't access treatment often turned to the margins of society. Homeless shelters in major cities began. Seeing a familiar profile, men in their 30s, disciplined posture, eyes scanning every room. By the end of the decade, veterans made up a disproportionate number of the homeless population. How had survival led here? Communities struggled to respond. Local governments lacked funding. Non-profits filled gaps where they could, offering food, beds, and listening ears. Churches opened basements. Volunteers showed up after work. But goodwill couldn't replace policy. Was compassion enough without structure? Meanwhile, debates raged in Washington. How much responsibility did the government truly bear? Where did personal accountability end and national obligation begin? Every delay meant another veteran slipping through the cracks. Every compromise felt like another quiet loss. How many lives were negotiable? Cold linoleum floors echoed with slow footsteps. Fluorescent lights buzzed without warmth. The smell of stale coffee clung to crowded waiting rooms. Some veterans pushed back harder. They chained themselves to buildings, camped on government property, refused to be ignored. Their protests made headlines and made others uncomfortable. The image of the grateful soldier was replaced by something messier, angrier, more honest. Was America ready to face the consequences of its own history? Still, progress crept forward. Research funding increased. new diagnostic language began to form. Clinicians started to connect patterns that had been visible for years. The term post-traumatic stress disorder entered official manuals. Naming the wound was a beginning, but could it heal it? For many veterans, the answer came too late. Years of untreated trauma had already shaped their lives. Relationships were broken, careers derailed, health deteriorated, recognition offered validation, but not restoration. Can acknowledgement undo what time has already taken? The system was changing, but the damage was already done. Who would pay the price? By the end of the 1970s, America stood in uneasy awareness. It had sent a generation to fight a war it didn't fully understand and brought them home to a system that didn't understand them either. The consequences were no longer hidden. They were visible on streets, in hospitals, in families across the country. And yet one final question loomed larger than all the rest. Could a nation that struggled to face its past ever truly care for those who carried it? The wounds finally had a name. The system finally began to listen. But healing required more than recognition. It required transformation, and America wasn't there yet. Time was supposed to heal everything. Years passed, decades even, but for many, the war only learned how to hide better. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, America began to move on, at least on the surface. New music filled the airwaves. Economic priorities shifted. Political language changed. Vietnam slowly disappeared from nightly news broadcasts, replaced by fresher crises. The country wanted distance from the memory. But distance does not erase impact, does it? For veterans, time worked differently. The sharp edges of trauma dulled, but the weight remained. Some learned to manage it. Others carried it like a constant ache. Anniversaries triggered memories. Smells, sounds, even weather could reopen doors long thought closed. A humid summer night could feel too much like the jungle. How do you escape a past that lives inside your senses? Many veterans tried to rebuild. They married again, changed careers, moved across the country. On paper, their lives looked stable, but stability often rested on fragile ground. Suppressed memories have a way of resurfacing when least expected. What happens when the mind can't hold them down anymore? The war was no longer on television, but it was still playing in their heads. Would it ever stop? A new generation began to notice. Children who grew up with distant fathers or emotionally absent parents started asking questions. Why did loud noises cause panic? Why did anger appear without warning? These families lived with invisible rules. Don't ask, don't push, don't remind. Silence became inheritance. What does a child learn when pain goes unspoken? Some veterans found purpose in helping others like themselves. Peer support groups grew stronger. Shared language formed. Stories that once felt unspeakable were told cautiously, then more freely. In these spaces, men realized they were not alone, and that realization mattered. Could connection succeed where institutions failed? Yet not everyone found that path. Addiction continued to claim lives quietly. Suicide remained a shadow statistic. Communities mourned without fully understanding. The war no longer shocked the nation. It exhausted it. How dangerous is fatigue when it replaces outrage? A television hummed late at night. An empty house smelled faintly of cold coffee. Somewhere, a man stared at the ceiling counting breaths. Culture began to reflect what politics had avoided. Films, books, and music slowly explored the veteran experience, not as heroes or villains, but as damaged human beings. These stories unsettled audiences. They challenged comfortable myths, and in doing so, they reopened old debates. Was America ready to hear the truth this time? Public empathy grew unevenly. Some listened, some turned away. A nation divided in memory struggled to agree on meaning. The war became a cautionary tale, a symbol, a wound. But symbols can distance as much as they reveal. Who was still being left out of the conversation? America remembered Vietnam as history. Veterans remembered it as life. Could those two memories ever align? As the years passed, the cost became generational. Trauma-shaped parenting styles, relationships, and expectations. Patterns repeated, anger echoed, absence lingered. The war's influence extended beyond those who fought it, touching families who never saw a battlefield. How long can the consequences of a war last? By the time the nation looked back with clarity, much had already been lost. Healing had happened in fragments, not systems. Progress came unevenly, and for many veterans the question remained unresolved. Was survival enough if peace never truly arrived? The war refused to fade. Its echoes stretched across generations, and one final reckoning waited ahead. What does a nation owe those who carry its unfinished wars? The questions never stopped. They were just asked more quietly, and for many veterans, the answers came far too late. By the mid to late 1980s, the United States had begun to reshape its public memory of Vietnam. Memorials were built, ceremonies were held, names were carved into stone. The nation paused, finally willing to look back, carefully, respectfully. But remembrance is not the same as repair, is it? For many veterans, these gestures stirred complicated emotions. Some felt seen for the first time. Others felt reopened. Standing before a wall of names brought back faces, voices, moments frozen in time. Healing and grief collided in the same space. Could a monument carry both honor and regret? Slowly, policy followed symbolism. Mental health services expanded. PTSD became widely recognized. Research improved. Younger clinicians entered the system with better tools and deeper understanding. Support programs grew more structured. Yet for veterans who had waited decades, progress felt bittersweet. How do you heal a wound that was left untreated for so long? The country was finally listening, but many of the voices were already gone. Who was this healing really for? Communities continued to carry the weight. Spouses who had endured years of emotional distance. Children who learned early how to read moods and avoid triggers. Families shaped by caution rather than comfort. These were the quiet casualties, rarely acknowledged, rarely counted. Can healing be complete if it ignores everyone affected? Some veterans found late peace. Therapy helped. Peer connections deepened. Faith, art, and routine provided anchors. Others remained trapped between memories and regret. Aging bodies carried younger minds that never left the war behind. As years passed, time compressed, past and present blurred. Does trauma age or does it simply wait? The national conversation shifted again with new conflicts abroad. A new generation of soldiers returned from different wars, carrying eerily familiar struggles. Vietnam veterans watched closely. Some spoke out, warning of what neglect could become. Others stayed silent, tired of repeating lessons already learned the hard way. Would history listen this time? Rain tapped softly against the memorial wall. Cold stone held the weight of countless names. A hand lingered, tracing letters carved decades ago. By the 1990s, acknowledgement was widespread. But accountability remained diffuse. No single moment closed the chapter. No clear resolution arrived. Healing was uneven, personal, incomplete. The war's legacy lived not in textbooks, but in people. And people do not move on all at once. What became clear, however, was this. Ignoring trauma only delays its reckoning. Vietnam had taught that lesson at an extraordinary cost. Whether the nation would remember, it was another question entirely. The war had been named, its wounds had been studied, but had its lesson truly been learned? As the century turned, Vietnam veterans aged quietly. Some carried peace, others carried questions they would never see answered. And behind them stood families and communities, shaped by decades of silent consequence. The reckoning had come, slowly, imperfectly. But one final truth remained unavoidable. Wars do not end when the fighting stops. They end when those who fight them are truly brought home. America had begun to remember, but remembrance alone was not enough. The final chapter still waited to be written. Who decides when a war is finally over? The war was no longer visible, but its shadow stretched across decades, and it was still shaping lives in ways America rarely acknowledged. As Vietnam veterans moved into older age, their stories began to surface with a new urgency. Time narrowed the distance between past and present. Retirement slowed daily distractions. Silence grew longer. Memories, once pushed aside by work and responsibility, returned with clarity. For many, the war felt closer in their 70s than it had in their 40s. Why do some battles wait for age to reveal themselves? Healthcare systems faced new challenges. Aging bodies complicated long-standing trauma. Pain management, cognitive decline, and unresolved psychological wounds intersected. Doctors treated symptoms layered upon symptoms. The line between physical illness and emotional memory blurred. How do you care for someone whose pain has lasted a lifetime? Families confronted truths they had long avoided. Adult children began to understand their parents' distance, anger or silence in a new light. Conversations happened late, sometimes too late. Apologies were offered, forgiveness was sought, but time is an unforgiving negotiator. How much understanding can arrive before goodbye? The war was older now. So were the men who fought it. But had peace ever really arrived? Public narratives softened. Veterans were increasingly framed as survivors, rather than symbols. Schools taught Vietnam with more nuance. Museums told more complete stories. Yet gaps remained. Some voices were still missing. Those who never spoke, never healed, never came home in any sense. Who remembers them? Across the country, veteran communities became living archives. Stories passed between peers carried honesty. Textbooks could not. Shared laughter mixed with shared grief. In these spaces, memory became collective, not isolating. Could connection succeed where decades of silence had failed? At the same time, new wars continued to send young people into combat. Vietnam veterans watched history repeat itself, often with uneasy recognition. Some mentored younger soldiers, others retreated exhausted by repetition. The shadow of one war stretched into the next. Had America truly learned anything? An old photograph crackled in trembling hands. A voice faltered mid-sentence, then steadied. A room filled with stories that had waited decades to be heard. The national reckoning remained incomplete. Honor was expressed. Lessons were discussed. But systemic care still lagged behind understanding. Progress existed, but it was fragile. And fragility, veterans knew well, was dangerous. How many times could the same mistakes be made? As the number of living Vietnam veterans declined, urgency grew. History was no longer abstract. It was leaving the room. Each loss carried not only a life, but a perspective. What disappears when the witnesses are gone? The war was fading from memory, but its consequences were not. What would be left behind? By the 2010s, Vietnam had become both distant and present, a war many Americans knew only through documentaries and films, yet one that continued to shape policy, culture, and military care. Its legacy was uneven, part warning, part wound, and one final moment remained, quiet, unavoidable, and deeply human. The last voices were growing quiet. The shadow was finally lifting. But before it disappeared completely, one question demanded an answer. What do we owe those who carried? A war for a lifetime? And what do we owe those who come after them? No announcement marked the end. No treaty declared it finished. The war ended quietly. One life, one memory, one unanswered question at a time. For Vietnam veterans, the final chapter did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, unevenly across kitchens, hospital rooms, and quiet living rooms. Some men found peace in old age. Others never did. But all of them carried something that could not be measured in years or medals. The war had shaped who they became, and who they never got the chance to be. Can a life ever be separated from the moments that defined its survival? As the generation aged, remembrance took on a different meaning. Memorial days grew quieter. Funerals became more frequent than reunions. Flags folded carefully into triangles were handed to spouses, children, grandchildren. The words spoken were formal, respectful, but often incomplete. How do you summarize a lifetime of invisible battles in a few ceremonial sentences? Families became the final witnesses. Children and grandchildren inherited stories, habits, silences. They learned what the war had taken by observing what was never said. In some homes, healing arrived through conversation. In others, it never fully came. But awareness grew, and awareness, however late, mattered. Does understanding always come too late? Or is it simply slower than pain? The war was no longer being fought, but its lessons were still being tested. Would America remember them? Institutions evolved. Veteran care improved. Trauma-informed language entered public life. New soldiers returned from new wars with better tools, clearer diagnoses and louder advocates. Much of that progress, traced back to Vietnam, earned through suffering rather than foresight. Should lessons always require sacrifice to be learned? The Vietnam War became a reference point, a warning embedded in policy debates and military doctrine. Leaders spoke of bringing soldiers home the right way, of preparing, not just for combat, but for return. Yet intentions did not always translate into action. Systems still strained, individuals still fell through cracks. Was the nation honoring the lesson, or merely repeating the promise? Veterans who remained watched this unfold with complex emotions. Pride that their pain had led to change, anger that it had been necessary at all, relief mixed with grief. History, they knew, rarely moved cleanly forward. It circled, tested, returned. Could the future truly be different? A quiet room filled with late afternoon light, the soft rustle of old letters being unfolded, a long breath released, finally unguarded. As the last Vietnam veterans passed on, the war shifted fully into memory. Museums preserved artifacts. Archives stored testimonies. Documentaries captured voices that would never speak again. The responsibility of remembrance moved outward, from those who lived it to those who learned it. Memory became stewardship. Who would carry it with care? The answer slowly became clear. Everyone. Because the Vietnam War was never just a military conflict. It was a human one. Its legacy lived in families, communities, and institutions shaped by absence and endurance. To remember it fully meant more than honoring service. It meant acknowledging cost, honestly, completely, without comfort. The war did not end in Vietnam. It ended across decades inside people. And even now its echo remains. A war truly ends, not when the guns fall silent, but when those who fought are finally understood. Vietnam taught America that forgetting is easy, but healing is not. That sending people to war is a decision measured not in months, but in lifetimes. And that bringing them home means far more than a plane landing safely on a runway. So when history asks whether the Vietnam War is finally over, the answer is not found in dates or documents. It is found in one enduring question. Have we learned how to bring our soldiers home?